Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All right. This time we're tackling masculinity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, we've got a pretty diverse set of sources lined up. Articles from psychology publications, men's health resources, some think tank pieces, and to kick things off, a lively Reddit thread.
Wow, covering all the bases, I see.
Yeah. So we're going to be exploring masculinity from all angles,
Yeah.
the good, the bad, the impact it has on men's health, and how society views it all.
It feels like such a relevant topic right now. I mean,
Yeah.
we're constantly reevaluating what masculinity means, right? Trying to find that balance between the positive aspects and, well, the potential downsides.
Exactly. And that's actually a perfect place to start, that whole push and pull between the positive and negative.
Yeah.
One of our sources, a Reddit discussion, jumped right into defining positive masculinity. And it's interesting in some of the traits that came up. Bravery, honor, strength, being decisive, self-reliant, a protector, provider, honest, loyal. It's a pretty long list.
It is. And it kind of highlights how those traits, when expressed in a healthy way, can be really valuable, not just for men themselves, but for society as a whole. Like, think about it. Those are qualities we often look for in leaders, people we want to rely on.
Totally. But here's where things get a little tricky. Those same traits can lead to some pretty rigid expectations.
Oh, yeah.
Like that old stereotype about men having to be the ones to open pickle jars.
Oh, come on. You're going there.
I know, right? But it's like, why is that seen as a man's job? It's funny, but...
But it illustrates a point, right? How we arbitrarily assign these traits to genders. And when those expectations become too rigid, that's when we start to see what's often labeled toxic masculinity. And it's not about the traits themselves, it's about how they're perceived and enforced.
Exactly. And the Men's Resource Center article we have really emphasizes that. They talk about all the good that can come from masculinity, how it can be a source of strength and purpose. But they emphasize that it needs balance. It's not about throwing traditional masculinity out the window. It's about expressing those traits in a healthy and constructive way.
And that ties in directly to the impact on men's health. That seems to be a major theme in a lot of the sources we've been looking at.
Yeah, it does. There's this one article from News Medical. It highlights some pretty concerning stats about the negative health impacts that can come from strictly adhering to those traditional masculine norms.
Right.
They found that men who strongly identify with those norms often face barriers to seeking preventive care. They're less likely to go to the doctor for checkups or, address those health concerns early on. And they're also more likely to delay seeking professional help.
When they really need it, yeah. Which can obviously have pretty serious consequences.
Right. And it's not just physical health either. This delay in getting help, it often stems from having difficulty expressing their emotions, especially emotions that are seen as unmanly. Right? It's like if you're taught from a young age to suppress those feelings, to just tough it out, it makes it really difficult to open up about struggling, especially with mental health. Men might feel embarrassed or ashamed to admit they're struggling.
Yeah, and that can prevent them from getting the support they really need.
Totally. So it becomes this vicious cycle. And there's this study mentioned in the Center for Male Psychology article, and really brings this point home. They found that men who believe that masculinity negatively impacts their behavior tend to have a less positive mindset.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we know that can be correlated with suicidal thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty alarming, right?
It is concerning. But we also have to acknowledge another side to this, too, right? The same article talks about 40 years of research showing that men who embody those traditionally masculine traits, things like independence, competitiveness, and self-confidence, are actually less likely to be depressed. So it's not as simple as saying masculinity equals bad for men's mental health.
It's definitely more nuanced than that. So it sounds like maybe it's about finding that sweet spot, that balance.
Well, that's what the research seems to suggest. And interestingly, those studies found that men who score low in both masculinity and femininity, the undifferentiated group, they're actually at higher risk of depression. It's like having a healthy mix of traits is key.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not about getting rid of masculinity altogether. It's about finding a way to express it in a healthy way.
Exactly.
So I guess it's not about pushing men to be less masculine, but more about encouraging a wider range of emotional expression and self-awareness.
That seems to be the general idea.
Okay, so we've got this complex relationship then between traditional masculinity, mental health, and finding that balance. But how do we actually get there? How do we guide young men towards a healthier sense of masculinity?
Well, that brings us to a really interesting argument from Michael Gurian. He wrote a piece for Psychology Today, and he actually suggests that boys need more masculinity, more fathering, and more healthy models of manhood to thrive.
Wait, more? That seems a little counterintuitive.
Right. Given what we were just talking about.
Yeah, with the downsides of traditional masculinity and all.
But he makes a pretty compelling case. His argument is that boys, they have unique developmental needs, and that trying to suppress or neutralize those needs can actually be detrimental.
Okay, so how does he back that up?
He uses examples from his own clinical practice. He talks about this young client named Tony.
Okay, tell me more about Tony. I'm intrigued.
So Tony was struggling with some emotional and behavioral issues, and Gurian found that traditional talk therapy really wasn't effective. But when he started to incorporate more physical movement, visual spatial activities into the sessions, things started to shift. Tony was able to connect with his emotions and actually process his experiences in a way that resonated with him.
So it's about recognizing that boys might respond to different approaches than what we traditionally use. Approaches that are maybe more in line with like their natural inclinations and how they learn best.
Right, exactly. His argument is that the male brain is wired differently, and we need to tailor our approaches to support healthy development in boys.
Which again brings us back to the importance of father figures, mentors, people who can guide boys through that transition from boyhood to manhood. And that actually ties in perfectly with another point from the Men's Resource Center article. They talk about this thing called the failure to launch phenomenon. Essentially, it's about young men struggling to transition into adulthood, having a hard time finding their place in the world. And one of the factors they suggest is contributing to that is this lack of clear mentorship and guidance. It's like boys are missing those role models, those rites of passage that traditionally help them understand what it means to be a man. Like, think about it. In a lot of cultures, there used to be clear markers of entering manhood.
Yeah.
Today, not so much.
Not so much, no. It's kind of blurry.
So if those traditional structures are fading and we can't just erase masculine traits, how do we actually help young men develop a healthy sense of self? I mean, what models are we giving them?
Well, the Men's Resource Center article uses a really interesting example to illustrate how societal views of masculinity have shifted over time. Batman, yeah. They compare how he was portrayed in, like, the 1940s to how he's depicted today.
Oh, wow, I see. Like Adam West versus Christian Bale.
Right.
That's quite a contrast.
Exactly. And it's a really good way to visualize the evolution of the ideal. The early Batman, he was flawed, sure, but he was still seen as a protector, a symbol of justice. But as society has changed, Batman has become darker, more brooding, more isolated, even violent at times.
It's like the idealized image of masculinity itself has become more, I don't know, complex.
Yeah. And arguably less aspirational in some ways.
Right. The article also mentions this concern that as society becomes more diverse and egalitarian, there might be a backlash of hypermasculinity as a response.
It's definitely something we see throughout history. When traditional power structures are challenged, there's often this push to reassert those traditional values.
Yeah.
And that sometimes manifests in more extreme expressions of masculinity.
Yeah, it's like some men feel threatened by these societal shifts.
Right.
And they kind of double down on what they see as traditional masculinity to hold on to that sense of power or identity.
Exactly. And that can be a problem because that kind of rigid clinging to outdated norms, it often leads to the very toxic behaviors that, we're trying to move away from.
It creates division instead of understanding.
Absolutely.
So we're seeing these societal shifts, the evolution of masculine ideals and this potential for backlash. But where does that leave men in terms of finding meaning and purpose?
Well, that's where Samuel Hillior's article from Plough Quarterly comes in. He offers a really thought-provoking perspective. His argument is that modern men are being taught that the universe is inherently meaningless, and that this is actually dampening their natural spiritedness, that drive to achieve, to find a higher purpose.
It's interesting. So you're saying that, like, without that sense of greater meaning, that drive can become misdirected or lost.
That's his argument. He says that in the past, men often found that sense of meaning through things like religion, their community, tradition. But in a more secular world, those sources of meaning aren't as prominent.
So if those traditional sources of meaning are fading, where do we go from here? How do we help men connect to that sense of purpose in a world that feels, increasingly fragmented?
Well, I think one place to look is at the role of traditional institutions and faith. Halier makes this fascinating comparison between traditional masculinity ideology and the ancient Greek concept of spiritedness.
Okay, break that down for me. What is spiritedness in this context?
So in Greek philosophy, spiritedness referred to a kind of vital energy, a drive for achievement, for honor, a
Mhm.
willingness to risk and strive for something greater than oneself. And Halier argues that you can find this same drive in traditional masculinity, but it needs to be channeled, directed towards virtuous pursuits.
So it's not about suppressing that drive, it's about finding a way to express it in a way that benefits both the individual and society. It reminds me of that whole boys will be boys mentality.
Mhm.
It's often used to excuse bad behavior, but what if we could harness that energy and put it towards something positive?
That's a great point. I think that's exactly what Halier is getting at. He seems to be saying that traditional masculinity at its core has this potential for good, but it needs to be guided by a sense of higher purpose, a set of values that go beyond just individual desires.
And he contrasts this with what he sees as the modern emphasis on harm reduction and comfort increase, especially the approach advocated by the APA, the American Psychological Association.
Yeah.
He argues that just focusing on minimizing harm and maximizing comfort lacks a higher purpose. Like it doesn't offer a vision of what men should be striving for.
I see. So he's saying that the APA guidelines, while well-intentioned, might be missing the mark in terms of providing men with a sense of direction.
Right, like a reason to push themselves beyond just avoiding discomfort.
Makes sense.
He specifically takes issue with the APA's encouragement for a psychologist to challenge religious teachings that contribute to harmful masculinities. He argues that religion, while potentially problematic in some aspects, can also provide that sense of higher purpose he sees as lacking in the modern approach.
It is a tricky issue, isn't it?
It is. On one hand, we want to address the harmful aspects of those teachings, but on the other hand, we don't want to just dismiss the potential good that religion can offer. I mean, a lot of men find a really strong sense of purpose and community through their faith, and they can be incredibly beneficial, especially in a world that feels more and more secular.
Absolutely. It's about finding that balance. We can't just throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, but we also can't ignore the potential for harm. It's a conversation that often gets very heated and polarized.
It does, and I think Heliar's article really highlights that tension.
Yeah.
It's this delicate balance between respecting individual beliefs and addressing potential harm. So we've got these societal shifts, the evolution of masculine ideals, and this potential backlash, but also this potential loss of meaning in a more secular world. It's a lot to unpack.
It is, and it's important to acknowledge that this is just the beginning of the conversation. There are so many different perspectives and experiences out there, and I think the key is to keep listening, keep learning, and keep challenging ourselves to think critically about these issues.
And that's what we're going to continue to do in the next part of our deep dive.
It's funny, isn't it? It's like the very institutions that were traditionally seen as, upholding masculinity, they're now being questioned. Think about the military, organized religion, even sports. They're all going through these reckonings with how they've shaped and sometimes limited what it means to be a man.
Yeah, it's almost like a paradox, right? We were just talking about how that lack of traditional structures like mentorship and those clear rites of passage might actually be contributing to some of the problems young men are facing today. But at the same time, those same institutions are being criticized for perpetuating some of the harmful aspects of masculinity. It's like, how do you find that balance?
It's a tangled web for sure. And it gets even more complicated when you bring in the role of faith and religious teachings in shaping masculinity. We were talking about Samuel Heliar's critique of those APA guidelines earlier, and he seemed pretty concerned about the encouragement for psychologists to challenge religious teachings that might contribute to harmful masculinities.
Yeah, he seemed to think it was overstepping a boundary. But, there's that valid point that some religious teachings can definitely reinforce those rigid gender roles and expectations, and those can be harmful to both men and women. It's like, how do you acknowledge the potential for harm without dismissing the potential good that religion can offer? I mean, a lot of men find a really strong sense of purpose and community through their faith, and that can be incredibly beneficial, especially in a world that feels increasingly secular.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so important to remember that there isn't just one religious perspective on masculinity. Just like there are all these different expressions of masculinity, there are so many different interpretations of religious teachings, even within the same faith.
That's such a good point. It's so easy to fall into those generalizations. We need to be careful about painting with such broad strokes.
For sure. We need to engage with the individual perspectives and experiences within religious communities and realize that even within the same faith or tradition, individuals might hold different views on masculinity.
It always comes back to those open and honest dialogues, even if they're difficult.
Mm.
And understanding that those dialogues might lead to different conclusions or interpretations. There isn't one right answer.
It reminds me of something you said earlier. It's complex.
I did, didn't I?
But I think that's key, leaning into that complexity. Because it's so tempting to just look for easy answers, but the reality is this is a multifaceted issue. We've got to be nuanced in our thinking.
So, okay, if we can't rely on a single institution like religion to provide all the answers, where do we go from here? If you're a young man trying to figure all of this out, how do you navigate these complex questions about masculinity and find your own path? I mean, it can feel pretty overwhelming, right?
Yeah, I can see that. I think part of the solution is shifting the focus away from trying to define masculinity in terms of this fixed set of traits or behaviors. It's less about checking off boxes and more about recognizing that there's this vast spectrum of experiences and expressions of masculinity. What works for one man might not work for another.
It's like ditch the one-size-fits-all model and embrace the individuality.
Exactly. And that really resonated with me in Michael Gurian's article. He talks about how different men might need different types of support and mentorship to thrive. It's not a formula. He used the example of his client Tony, who benefited from a more hands-on, physically active approach to therapy. Traditional talk therapy wasn't really doing it for him, but engaging his body, his spatial reasoning skills, that opened up new pathways for him to actually process his emotions.
So it's about meeting men where they're at and being adaptable in our approaches.
Right.
Some men might need those more traditional forms of guidance, while others might thrive in environments that encourage them to express themselves in non-traditional ways. It's not about pushing one model over another. It's about having options and understanding individual needs.
Exactly. Yeah. And a huge part of that is listening to what men are actually saying about their needs and experiences, not projecting our own assumptions onto them. I think sometimes there's this tendency to speak for men instead of letting them speak for themselves.
That is a really good point. It's about amplifying those voices and really hearing what they're saying, not what we think they're saying or what we think they should be saying. And that listening needs to go beyond just individual experiences too. We need to be aware of the broader societal forces that shape how men see themselves.
Absolutely. It's everything, from the messages men receive from the media, pop culture, family, friends, their communities.
And of course, those traditional institutions that we were talking about earlier are the ones that historically have had such a huge influence on how men are supposed to behave.
Which brings us right back to that tension we were discussing earlier. The need for structure and guidance versus the need to challenge the harmful aspects of those structures. It's a tricky one.
It's a tightrope walk. It's like we need to find a way to reclaim the best of those traditions, the mentorship, the sense of community, the rites of passage, while adapting them to a world that's vastly different from the one those traditions emerged in.
I think you're right. Maybe part of that adaptation involves creating new traditions and rituals that better reflect the values and needs of men today. I mean, think about it. The world has changed so much, but our ideas about masculinity haven't always kept pace. So we have to ask ourselves, what does healthy and fulfilling manhood look like in the 21st century?
That's such a powerful question. And it really underscores the need for creativity and innovation in how we approach this whole issue. We can't just sit back and critique what's wrong. We need to actively imagine and build something new, something better.
Something that supports the well-being of everyone, not just men, women, families, communities, all of us.
It's about fostering that sense of interconnectedness, right? Recognizing that healthy masculinity benefits everyone, not just men themselves. So if we're moving away from that rigid, one-dimensional view of masculinity, what are some alternative models we can look to? What does healthy and fulfilling masculinity actually look like in action?
Well, I think one of the most powerful examples we have comes from Fatherhood, which was a central theme in Patrick Fagan's article. He presented a pretty traditional perspective, arguing that a man's ability to sustain a stable marriage for the benefit of his wife and children, that's the core measure of positive masculinity.
He had some pretty compelling stats to back up his claim, too. He showed how children in intact families tend to do better across a whole range of social indicators: education, income, health, well-being.
I know his viewpoint might not resonate with everyone, but I think there's something really valuable in his emphasis on commitment, responsibility, and providing that loving and supportive environment for children. It highlights the profound impact fathers can have.
It's about recognizing and empowering men to embrace that role fully, not just as providers, but as nurturers, as emotional anchors. And let's be honest, that's a role that hasn't always been encouraged or supported in those traditional notions of masculinity.
No, definitely not. But for fathers to really thrive in that role, they need support, resources, mentorship. They need to feel valued and appreciated for those contributions. It's not just about telling men to step up, it's about creating the space for them to do so.
So it's not just about fathers stepping up, it's about families, communities, workplaces, even policymakers stepping up to support fathers. Make it easier for men to be actively involved in their children's lives.
Absolutely. It's about creating a culture that truly values fatherhood, that recognizes how vital fathers are to the well-being of families and communities. It's about making space for fathers to be present, emotionally engaged, and to express their love and care in ways that might not always fit those traditional masculine stereotypes.
It's about recognizing the power of a father's love and how that can impact not just his children, but ripple out into the wider world. And who knows, maybe in supporting fathers in this way, we're also creating a society that fosters a healthier and more fulfilling masculinity for all men.
It's a goal worth striving for sure. And it all starts with challenging those assumptions, embracing the complexity, and having those open and honest conversations. We need to keep listening, keep learning, and keep evolving in our understanding of what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
And I think a big part of that evolution involves letting go of some of those long-held assumptions about what it means to be a man. It seems like we're moving towards a place where men don't have to feel like they have to fit into this, like, predefined box. Letting go of the idea that men have to be stoic and unemotional, or that being vulnerable is somehow weak.
Yeah, absolutely. Those expectations can be so damaging. I mean, they can lead to stress, anxiety, even depression, and they can prevent men from seeking help when they need it.
Right. It's like you're carrying all this weight around and feeling like they can't express their true feelings or ask for support.
It can be really isolating.
It is. And it takes a toll. And it's not just mental health either, right? It impacts relationships too.
Yeah.
If you can't be open and vulnerable, it's hard to build those truly intimate connections.
It is. It makes you wonder about the messages we're sending to boys, like, what are we teaching them about what's expected of them? We need to create space for them to embrace, like, the full spectrum of human emotion, to understand that it's okay to feel sadness or fear, even joy, without feeling like they're betraying some idea of what it means to be a man.
Right. Like vulnerability and empathy, those aren't weaknesses.
No.
They're strengths that can actually help men connect with others on a much deeper level.
Absolutely. I mean, we're social beings. We thrive on connection. But sometimes that emphasis on individual achievement, on independence in traditional masculinity, it can overshadow the importance of those connections.
It's almost like there's this rule that men should just be able to handle everything on their own.
Yeah. Which isn't realistic or healthy at all.
Not at all. So it's not just about men changing, is it? It's about shifting the whole cultural narrative around masculinity, recognizing that men need support systems, they need community, they need those deep bonds just like anyone else.
Exactly. Men need a sense of belonging, a place where they can just be themselves without judgment, where they can share their struggles and their triumphs and, where they can find that sense of purpose and meaning that we were talking about earlier.
Which brings us back to Samuel Heliar's point about the search for a higher calling. He was arguing that in a world where those traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, family, are maybe less prominent, men might struggle to find something to believe in, something to fight for.
And that can be a really slippery slope, leading to disillusionment, apathy, even despair. It's like if the universe is inherently meaningless, then what's the point? Why bother striving, pushing yourself, being a good person?
Yeah. So how do we help men navigate that? How do we foster that sense of purpose and meaning in a world that, feels increasingly complex and uncertain?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't one answer. What gives one man a sense of meaning might be completely different for another.
So you're saying there isn't one right way to be a man, one path to finding that meaning and purpose?
Exactly. It's going to be a personal journey for each individual, shaped by their values, their interests, their experiences, their circumstances. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
So it's about empowering men to define their own masculinity.
Yes.
On their own terms.
Yes.
And create a path that aligns with, their authentic selves and their deepest values.
Absolutely. And I think for some men, that might involve reconnecting with those more traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, family. But for others, it might involve finding new ways to connect with something larger than themselves. through activism, social justice work, creative expression, or even connecting with nature. It's about finding that balance between honoring the past while embracing the present and looking towards the future.
And recognizing that the journey itself is just as important as the destination.
It is. It's about growth, evolution, and constantly striving to become the best versions of ourselves.
And that's a journey worth taking, right? Both for individual men and for society as a whole. So as we wrap up this deep dive into masculinity, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling both challenged and hopeful.
Me too. It's clear that this is a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah,
But it's also an issue that's generating so many important conversations, which is a good thing.
it really is. It's pushing us to reevaluate those assumptions and to create a more expansive vision of what it means to be a man in today's world.
It's inspiring, it's inspiring men to challenge the status quo and to create new possibilities, not just for themselves, but for future generations. And that's definitely something to celebrate.
It is. So to our listeners, we encourage you to continue this conversation in your own lives, in your communities. Think about what masculinity means to you and how you can contribute to creating a healthier, more fulfilling vision of manhood for yourself and for those around you.
It's a journey worth taking, for sure. And we're all in this together.
We are. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.